The baker received a letter meant for someone else. An Inspector Price mystery, BBC radio drama. By 7:30 every morning, the smell of fresh bread had already reached the village green, arriving with greater punctuality than the post, the buses, or several members of the parish council. People often claimed they could tell what day of the week it was merely by standing outside William Foster's bakery. Fridays smelled faintly of cinnamon, Mondays carried more yeast than optimism, Saturday belonged to warm loaves and unnecessary conversations. William himself regarded these observations as pleasant nonsense. Bread smelled like bread. Customers merely attached memories to it, because memories required less kneading. He had just removed a tray of cottage loaves from the oven when the bell above the door rang. Mrs. Evelyn Harper entered with the determined expression of someone intending to buy one loaf and leave with opinions instead. "Good morning, William, it appears to be. You've become philosophical. I've become awake." She accepted this with a nod. "A brown loaf, if you please." "And today's news?" "There isn't any." William wrapped the loaf. "Remarkable. It won't last. It never does." Mrs. Harper lowered her voice despite there being no one else inside. "Someone's greenhouse glass has disappeared." "Gone?" "So they say." "Entirely. I believe that is how disappearing usually works." William handed over the bread. "I hope they find it. I hope they find whoever thought greenhouse glass was worth stealing." She left, apparently satisfied that the village remained capable of modest disorder. The bell rang again before silence had settled. This time it was Peter Lang, the village postman, balancing his leather bag with the air of a man who trusted gravity only in theory. "Morning? You've survived another hill." "Barely." Peter produced a small stack of envelopes. "One of these has caused me difficulty. That sounds unusually personal for the Royal Mail. I've delivered letters for 23 years. I dislike uncertainty." William wiped flour from his hands. "What sort?" Peter held up a cream envelope. There was nothing remarkable about it except the handwriting. It was elegant without being decorative. The ink had the dark richness of fountain pen writing, and the address read simply, "Mr. Thomas Ashcombe, The Bakery, Hawthorne Lane, Ashcombe." William frowned. "I've no Thomas. I know. No customer collects post here. I know. No house nearby belongs to an Ashcombe. I know." Peter sighed. "The sorting office insists this address exists because someone wrote it." William turned the envelope over. The seal remained unbroken. No return address. No stamp from another village that meant anything in particular. Only yesterday's postmark from somewhere 20 miles away. "Perhaps Thomas has arrived without introducing himself." Peter smiled. "If so, he's remarkably patient." William looked through the front window. Morning sunlight spread slowly across the green. Mrs. Harper had already stopped beside Mrs. Kendall to repeat the greenhouse story. Neither woman appeared burdened by evidence. "I'll ask around." Peter nodded with visible relief. "I'd appreciate that." He departed, leaving the mysterious envelope beside the till. William intended to think no more about it. Unfortunately, villagers possessed a habit of noticing anything left in plain sight. By 9 o'clock, 3 customers had asked whose letter it was. By 10, another insisted the handwriting looked expensive. At 10:30, Mr. Douglas Pierce, retired solicitor and enthusiastic observer of everyone's affairs except his own, examined it from a respectful distance. "Interesting. What is? The sort of paper?" William glanced down. "It appears to be paper. Good paper. I'll take your word." Mr. Pierce adjusted his spectacles. "People rarely use cream stationery nowadays. They rarely bake bread either. They buy yours." "I try not to take that personally." Mr. Pierce chuckled politely. "It suggests education." "The paper? The handwriting? I've met educated people who couldn't address an envelope." "So have I." He leaned slightly closer. "You haven't opened it?" "No." "Good. I wasn't planning to. I merely wondered. I imagine someone else is wondering as well." Mr. Pierce purchased 2 rolls and departed with the satisfied expression of a man who believed curiosity counted as civic responsibility. By midday, the envelope had become part of the bakery. Customers avoided touching it while ensuring they all looked at it. Children ignored it completely. Older residents studied it as though expecting it to confess. William eventually placed it beneath the cash box, simply to restore ordinary conversation. It worked for almost 12 minutes. The lunch crowd brought fresh speculation. Perhaps the writer had mistaken the village. Perhaps Thomas Ashcombe had lived there years ago. Perhaps it belonged to someone using another name. Each theory arrived fully formed and departed without proof. Only one person failed to comment. Miss Clara Finch entered shortly after 1, carrying a basket of wildflowers. She bought 2 currant buns. She noticed the corner of the cream envelope beneath the till. Then she deliberately looked away. Not quickly, not guiltily, simply with the careful restraint of someone choosing not to recognize something familiar. William observed this without appearing to. Years behind a counter had taught him that customers revealed themselves more readily when they believed no one watched. Miss Finch counted her coins twice. Busy today? Busier than usual. I'm glad. So am I. She smiled faintly. The village enjoys small mysteries. It seems to. She accepted her paper bag. I expect this one will resolve itself. It usually does. Eventually, she left before William could decide whether the last word had carried unusual weight. The afternoon settled into its ordinary rhythm. Bread cooled. Children spent pennies on buns. The church clock struck 3 with more confidence than accuracy. The envelope remained exactly where Peter had left it. It had neither explained itself nor attracted its owner. Yet by closing time, William found himself glancing at it more often than the day's accounts. Not because he wished to know what was inside. He had baked bread for nearly 30 years and understood that most difficulties began not with secrets, but with perfectly ordinary things arriving at the wrong place. Outside, the village carried on exactly as it always had. Inside the bakery, a single unopened letter rested quietly beneath the till, unnoticed by no one and understood by nobody. The following morning arrived beneath a sky the color of unpolished pewter, with a breeze that carried the scent of damp hedgerows instead of rain. William Foster unlocked the bakery before the church clock announced 7, discovering that the mysterious envelope occupied his thoughts before the ovens demanded his attention. It remained where he had placed it beneath the till, untouched, its cream paper oddly conspicuous against the darker wood. Business began quietly. The first customers spoke of the weather, the allotments, and whether the council intended to repair the uneven paving stones before someone respectable tripped over them. Yet each conversation drifted, sooner or later, toward the same unanswered question. "Any sign of your Mr. Ashcombe?" asked Mr. Ellis, accepting a loaf still warm enough to fog the wrapping paper. "None," William replied. "Though he's become unexpectedly popular. It takes very little to become interesting here, fortunately." By 8:30, the bakery held its usual morning queue. No one appeared impatient. Waiting for bread had long been accepted as part of village life, providing an opportunity to exchange observations disguised as casual remarks. Mrs. Evelyn Harper stood near the door, while retired solicitor Douglas Pierce occupied his habitual place behind her. Clara Finch arrived moments later with an empty basket, offering polite greetings before joining the line. A farm laborer, a school secretary, and 2 cyclists completed the gathering. Conversation wandered naturally until Mrs. Harper glanced toward the counter. "Still no owner?" William shook his head. "I'm beginning to think the letter enjoys the attention." Mr. Pierce smiled. "Objects occasionally acquire reputations beyond their usefulness." Mrs. Harper folded her arms. "I distinctly remember a gentleman asking for directions to Hawthorne Lane on Tuesday." "You told me it was Monday," said the school secretary. Mrs. Harper frowned. "No, Tuesday. It was certainly Monday. I was collecting library books. You weren't." "I most certainly was." Douglas Pierce adjusted his spectacles without intervening. Clara Finch examined the shelves of pastries with unusual concentration. William noticed the exchange but continued serving customers. Small disagreements rarely ended in agreement, yet they often revealed more than certainty ever managed. The farm laborer cleared his throat. "I saw a stranger as well." Mrs. Harper brightened. "There, you see? He wasn't asking for directions. What was he doing? Looking at the war memorial? For how long?" "A minute or two." Mrs. Harper looked disappointed. "That's hardly suspicious." "I didn't say it was." One of the cyclists laughed softly. "Seems every unfamiliar face acquires a purpose after the fact." Nobody contradicted him. William wrapped another loaf. "What did he look like?" The laborer hesitated. "Dark coat, so, hat. In this weather, quite." Mrs. Harper nodded decisively. "The same man." The school secretary frowned. "The gentleman I remember wore no hat." "You've just said there wasn't one." "I said I remembered Monday, and I remember Tuesday." William placed a bag of rolls upon the counter. "It appears your stranger has improved considerably through discussion." The remark produced restrained smiles. Even Clara allowed herself the faintest hint of amusement before lowering her eyes again. By the time the last customer departed, William realized every description had differed. One recalled grey hair, another brown. One insisted the visitor carried an umbrella despite the dry weather. Another was equally certain he had worn gloves. Only one point remained consistent. Each witness believed entirely in the accuracy of the memory. Late that morning, Peter Lang arrived with the day's post. "Anything for Mr. Ashcombe?" William asked. Peter laughed. "I was hoping you'd tell me." "No success. I've asked 3 neighboring villages. And? Nothing." Peter rested his satchel against the wall. "Funny thing about misdirected letters. Usually someone claims them within hours. This one hasn't." "No." His eyes settled briefly upon the envelope. "It feels almost deliberate." William looked up. "In what way?" Peter shrugged. "I couldn't honestly say." The uncertainty lingered after he left. Just before noon, the bakery door opened once more. An elderly woman entered, whom William recognized only slightly. She lived beyond the edge of the parish and visited infrequently. She purchased a small white loaf before noticing the envelope beside the till. "Oh," she said quietly. William looked at her. "Do you recognize the name?" "No." "The handwriting?" She hesitated. "It reminds me of someone." "Who?" "I'm afraid I couldn't tell you." Her answer sounded less evasive than genuinely uncertain. She accepted her change, thanked William, and departed with slow, thoughtful steps. The remark remained with him long after she disappeared from view. That afternoon, the village seemed unusually attentive. People crossing the green paused outside the bakery windows for no practical reason. Conversations ended when others approached, only to resume once they had passed. Nothing openly remarkable occurred, yet the ordinary rhythm of the day carried an unfamiliar tension, as though everyone expected a simple explanation to arrive at any moment. Instead, another customer brought something altogether different. The parish clerk entered carrying a bundle of notices for the community board. "I nearly forgot," he said. "Someone asked whether you'd received a letter by mistake." William stopped arranging loaves. "Who asked?" "I don't know." "You didn't recognize him?" The clerk frowned. "It wasn't a man." "No?" "I believe it was a woman." He considered the matter for another moment. "Though, now I think about it, I never actually saw her face." William said nothing. The clerk looked mildly embarrassed. Odd thing to forget. Not necessarily. After the notices had been pinned outside, William stood alone behind the counter. The envelope remained unopened. Yet every conversation surrounding it seemed to produce fewer answers than before. The letter itself had not changed. Only the memories of those who believed they had seen something connected to it had begun, quietly and politely, to disagree. The unsettled feeling followed William Foster into the next morning with greater persistence than the smell of fresh bread. He had slept soundly enough, yet every time he unlocked the bakery door, his eyes sought the cream envelope before anything else. It remained exactly where he had left it, unchanged in every visible respect, and somehow more troublesome for its complete stillness. By mid-morning, the usual trade slowed, allowing him to leave his assistant to mind the counter, while he carried a basket of fresh scones across the village green to the tea room. Mrs. Agnes Bell had ordered them for the afternoon gathering of the Historical Society, though experience suggested that history occupied only a fraction of their meetings. Tea and speculation were generally served in equal measure. The bell above the tea-room door announced his arrival. Round tables had already been arranged beneath lace curtains that softened the pale sunlight. Several familiar faces were present long before the official meeting time. Douglas Pierce sat beside the window reading yesterday's newspaper. Mrs. Harper stirred her tea with unnecessary determination. Clara Finch occupied a chair slightly apart from the others, examining a gardening magazine she appeared not to be reading. Mrs. Bell accepted the basket with satisfaction. "Perfect timing, William. I've learned that punctuality encourages repeat orders. It also disappoints people hoping to complain. I should hate to deprive them." A few restrained smiles traveled around the room. William might have returned directly to the bakery had Mrs. Bell not insisted upon pouring him a cup before he left. Refusing hospitality required greater effort than accepting it. He settled near the fireplace. Conversation wandered politely through village matters until, almost inevitably, Mrs. Harper placed her cup upon its saucer. "I hear the mysterious letter still hasn't found its owner." William inclined his head. "That is correct. It seems extraordinary." Douglas Pierce folded his newspaper. "Only because we've all decided it ought to be." Mrs. Harper looked unconvinced. "A letter addressed to a person who doesn't exist? We don't know that. No one has ever heard of Thomas Ashcombe. No one has admitted to it," Pierce replied mildly. The distinction passed unnoticed by most of those present. Another member of the society leaned forward. "I've been wondering whether Ashcombe might be a family name from years ago." "Then why send it to the bakery?" asked Mrs. Bell. "Perhaps the bakery stood somewhere else." William smiled faintly. "It has occupied the same corner for nearly 80 years. Then perhaps the writer remembered incorrectly." Mrs. Harper nodded, as though this settled everything. Clara Finch turned another page without lifting her eyes. The writer may have remembered perfectly. The room became quieter. Mrs. Bell looked toward her. "What makes you say that?" Clara answered carefully. "People often address letters according to habit rather than fact." Mrs. Harper frowned. "How can habit be more reliable than fact?" "It depends how long the habit lasted." No one immediately responded. Douglas Pierce studied Clara over the rim of his teacup, but asked nothing further. Instead, the conversation drifted toward village anniversaries and the difficulty of persuading volunteers to organize them. William listened only in part. Clara's remark lingered in his thoughts, because it sounded less like an opinion than an observation. After another few minutes, the meeting began in earnest. Mrs. Bell read extracts from parish records concerning the restoration of the old mill bridge. Attendance improved whenever photographs accompanied the discussion, and today, several faded prints circulated around the tables. One eventually reached William. The picture showed the village green nearly 40 years earlier. The bakery stood plainly in the background. He looked at it without particular interest until Douglas Pierce leaned closer. "Different sign," William nodded. "My father replaced it after taking over. The lettering was rather elegant. So everyone tells me." Pierce pointed toward the image. "And wasn't the adjoining premises once occupied by a stationer's shop?" Mrs. Bell overheard. "It was indeed," Mrs. Harper added. "Before that, it belonged to a family named Ashcroft." "No," Clara said quietly. "Ashcombe." Every head turned. She seemed surprised by her own certainty. "I beg your pardon?" asked Mrs. Bell. Clara looked down at the photograph. "I believe it was Ashcombe." Douglas Pierce removed his spectacles. "I'm almost certain the directory listed Ashcroft." "It didn't." Her reply remained perfectly courteous. "It was Ashcombe." Silence followed, not uncomfortable, merely thoughtful. Mrs. Bell rose to fetch an old parish directory from the shelf beside the fireplace. She leafed through brittle pages with growing concentration. "Here we are." She adjusted her glasses. "Ashcroft and Son, stationers." Clara accepted the book. She read the entry twice before returning it. "I must have confused it with something else." Mrs. Harper gave a small, satisfied nod. It happens. Yes, Clara replied. It does. Yet William noticed that her expression suggested neither embarrassment nor conviction. It resembled someone who had expected to find one answer and discovered another instead. When the meeting concluded, several members departed together across the green, continuing their discussion about forgotten shopkeepers and changing village businesses. William walked beside Douglas Pierce. "What did you make of that?" he asked. Pierce considered before answering. "I've spent enough years listening to witnesses to distrust confidence. You think Clara was mistaken? I think she believed herself correct. Is there a difference? There usually is." As they reached the bakery door, Peter Lang approached from the opposite direction, carrying his afternoon post. "I've something for you," the postman said. William accepted a folded sheet. It was not another letter, only a brief note from the regional sorting office requesting confirmation that no resident named Thomas Ashcombe could presently be identified within the parish boundaries. Peter sighed. "They're as puzzled as we are." William looked once more toward the envelope beneath the till. For the first time since it had arrived, he found himself wondering whether the question everyone kept asking was the wrong one altogether. By the time Inspector Price first noticed Mr. Edwin Marsh, the village had already formed an opinion about him. Opinions, he had often observed, grew more quickly than roses and required considerably less care. Marsh served as gardener at Hawthorne House, a substantial property standing a little beyond the churchyard, where old brick walls sheltered neat borders of lavender, foxgloves, and climbing roses. He had worked there for nearly 15 years. Every hedge answered to his shears with remarkable precision, yet the man himself rarely answered anyone. This silence had become a feature of village conversation. "He never says more than necessary," remarked Mrs. Larkin at the grocer's. "Perhaps that's why he gets so much done," replied the grocer. Others suggested he was unfriendly. Some believed he carried an old disappointment. A few insisted he had once been engaged and never recovered after the wedding failed to happen. No two accounts agreed, but all were offered with confidence. Inspector Price preferred certainty to confidence. He arrived at Hawthorne House shortly after 10 on a bright morning, invited by Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, whose concern had less to do with flowers than with an odd occurrence in the garden. Nothing had been stolen, nothing appeared broken. Yet someone had entered during the night and rearranged 3 stone pots along the southern path. "It sounds absurd when spoken aloud," she admitted as they walked through the grounds. "Many genuine concerns do," Price replied. "The gardener believes it matters. And you?" "I believe Mr. Marsh has never troubled me over trifles." They found the gardener kneeling beside a bed of white lilies, removing weeds with patient hands. He acknowledged their approach with a slight inclination of his head before returning to his work. "Good morning, Mr. Marsh," said the inspector. "Morning." Mrs. Whitcomb gestured toward the path. "Would you explain what you discovered?" Marsh rose slowly. "The pots?" "Yes, they've been moved." "How can you tell?" "The moss." Price stepped closer. Each stone container bore a pale ring where damp moss had grown. The marks no longer matched the paving beneath them. "They stood elsewhere?" "An inch or two. Only that," Marsh nodded. "Enough." Mrs. Whitcomb smiled apologetically. "You see why I hesitated before troubling anyone." Price continued examining the path. "Did anything else change?" "No. No footprints. The gravel was raked yesterday afternoon." "And afterwards?" "It stayed smooth." Price looked toward the gravel. There were no visible impressions. "Who has access to the garden?" "The household." "And visitors?" "Occasionally." Marsh answered each question without embellishment. His words emerged carefully, never hurried, never defensive. Silence did not seem a shield, but simply the manner in which he preferred to conduct himself. As they walked farther through the grounds, the inspector noticed something else. Bird feeders hung from several trees. Each had been freshly filled. "You look after these as well?" Marsh nodded. "They arrive every morning, so do you. They expect it." The reply carried no sentimentality, only quiet fact. Near the orchard wall stood a weathered wooden bench. Price paused beside it. "You sit here?" "Sometimes." "Anyone else?" "The lady of the house." "Recently?" "3 evenings ago." Mrs. Whitcomb looked surprised. "I don't remember." "You read a letter?" She frowned thoughtfully. "I may have." "You folded it twice." Her expression softened. "Yes, I believe I did." Price glanced between them. "You notice a great deal." Marsh gave the smallest of shrugs. "I notice the garden." They returned toward the terrace. Before leaving, the inspector asked one final question. If someone wished to pass through here unseen, could they? The gardener considered the paths, the hedges, and the orchard before answering. "Not unseen. No, only unnoticed." Price thanked him. As he walked back toward the village, he reflected that people had mistaken the gardener's silence for emptiness. Yet silence often preserved details that conversation scattered. A man who spent his days observing the smallest changes in living things might also recognize alterations others dismissed as insignificant. Whether those observations would matter remained uncertain. But Inspector Price had learned long ago that the quietest witness frequently remembered what everyone else had overlooked, not because he searched for mysteries, but because he had never acquired the habit of talking past them. Tuesday, in the village, possessed a curious reputation for uneventfulness. The market did not arrive until Thursday, the Women's Institute preferred Wednesday afternoons, and the parish council seldom risked meeting before the end of the month. Even so, the Reverend Matthew Ellison guarded his Tuesdays with remarkable consistency. Inspector Price became aware of the habit, not through inquiry, but through conversation. Mrs. Bell mentioned it while arranging flowers in the church porch. "You won't find the Reverend before luncheon. Does he visit parishioners?" the inspector asked. "Occasionally, and today, I couldn't say." Her answer was careful rather than uncertain. "He has always kept Tuesdays to himself." Price thanked her and crossed the churchyard at an unhurried pace. The morning carried the soft warmth of late summer, and several villagers paused to exchange greetings before continuing their errands. None appeared in haste, yet when the inspector casually mentioned the Reverend's Tuesday routine, the replies varied more than he expected. "He writes sermons," suggested the postmaster. "He walks the old footpaths," said a retired teacher. "I've seen him at the library," offered another resident. Each statement was delivered with confidence. None matched the others. The vicarage stood beyond a low stone wall, draped with climbing roses. Reverend Ellison welcomed the inspector with the calm courtesy that had become familiar throughout the parish. "Good morning, Inspector. I hope I'm not interrupting." Only the correspondence. Books covered the study walls from floor to ceiling. A teapot rested upon a tray beside neatly stacked letters. "You've chosen a pleasant room for paperwork. I find books less argumentative than committees." Price smiled. "I suspect they merely disagree more quietly." The Reverend returned the smile before pouring tea. "I imagine you've not come to discuss literature. I've come to ask about routine, a dangerous subject. So I've discovered." Price explained that several conversations had mentioned the Reverend's Tuesdays without agreeing on how they were spent. "I seem to have acquired an air of mystery, entirely by accident, I expect." "I hope so." The vicar folded his hands. "My Tuesdays are usually reserved for visiting parish records, stored at St. Anne's Chapel. The old vestry there is quieter than this study." "Does anyone accompany you?" "No. Every Tuesday." "Most." He spoke naturally, without the slightest sign of hesitation. Price accepted the explanation, but allowed the silence to linger. After a moment, the Reverend added, "I also stop at the cemetery on the return journey." "For pastoral reasons?" "For reflective ones." The inspector nodded. People often confuse the two. They finish their tea discussing the gradual decline of handwritten letters and the curious speed with which rumors traveled, despite the disappearance of regular correspondence. When Price eventually rose to leave, the Reverend walked with him as far as the front gate. "There is one thing," Ellison said. "Yes?" "Last Tuesday, I noticed someone leaving the chapel just as I arrived." "Did you recognize them?" "No." "A visitor?" "I couldn't honestly say." "What made you remember?" "The person closed the gate behind them. Price looked mildly surprised. That seems an ordinary courtesy. It is. The Reverend glanced toward the lane, which is precisely why it remained in my mind. Most visitors forget. Later that afternoon, the inspector visited St. Anne's Chapel. The building stood quietly among yew trees, its stone walls weathered by generations of wind and rain. Inside, the vestry contained shelves of aging parish registers and little else. Nothing appeared disturbed. The caretaker, Mrs. Hensley, arrived carrying fresh candles. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wondered whether you've noticed unusual visitors recently. She thought for a moment. Not unusual. Unknown, perhaps. Can you describe them? I'm afraid not. She smiled apologetically. I remember faces far less well than voices. And did anyone speak? Only to say good afternoon. A man? I believe so. She hesitated, though now I'm less certain than I was. The inspector thanked her before stepping back into the afternoon sunshine. As he followed the footpath toward the village, he reflected that certainty continued to dissolve whenever people attempted to describe the past. Actions remained clearer than appearances. A gate had been closed. A greeting had been exchanged. Someone had visited the chapel. Everything beyond those simple facts seemed to shift according to memory. Near the churchyard entrance, he encountered the Reverend once more, returning from an errand. "I've been thinking," Ellison said, "about Tuesday, about habits. They're often revealing." Indeed. The vicar looked back toward the chapel. We tend to notice the day someone breaks a habit more readily than the habit itself. Inspector Price inclined his head. It was an observation offered without emphasis, yet it settled comfortably among the many small remarks he had collected since arriving in the village. Experience had taught him that mysteries rarely announced themselves through dramatic discoveries. More often they advanced quietly, concealed within ordinary routines that everyone believed they already understood. Rain arrived before dawn with the quiet determination of something that had no intention of leaving quickly. By breakfast, the village roofs glistened beneath a steady drizzle, and the recreation ground, beyond the school, had become a broad sheet of darkened grass, interrupted only by winding footpaths and shallow puddles. Inspector Price found such mornings unexpectedly useful. Rain altered habits. People delayed errands, changed routes, accepted shelter with strangers, and remembered inconveniences with surprising clarity. It was rarely the weather itself that mattered, but the adjustments it forced upon ordinary lives. William Foster noticed the difference almost immediately. The bakery filled earlier than usual, as customers escaped the rain beneath its warm windows. Umbrellas collected beside the door, dripping quietly onto the worn tiles, while conversations drifted from one subject to another. The mysterious letter remained beneath the till. Its presence required no introduction now. Visitors merely glanced toward it before continuing whatever discussion had brought them inside. Mrs. Harper arrived wrapped in a waterproof coat whose practicality exceeded its elegance. "I nearly crossed the recreation ground," she announced while removing her gloves. "And wisely decided against it? I discovered someone already had." William looked up. "In this weather? Before it became heavy, I imagine. What makes you think so?" There were footprints. Several customers listened without interrupting. Mrs. Harper continued. "They didn't cross straight through. They wandered, as though whoever made them had stopped more than once." Douglas Pierce entered at that moment, folding a damp umbrella. "I heard the last remark," he said. "The paths are muddy enough to preserve prints all morning." Mrs. Harper nodded. "Exactly." Pierce accepted his loaf before adding, "Then we'd better be careful not to imagine too much from them." She looked faintly offended. "I'm perfectly capable of recognizing footprints. I don't doubt it. You sound as though you do. I merely question where they lead." William handed over the bread. "That seems a sensible question." Mrs. Harper departed unconvinced. Later that morning, Inspector Price walked across the recreation ground himself. The rain had eased to a fine mist. Children were absent, leaving the swings motionless, and the football posts standing alone against the grey sky. Near the center of the field, he found the impressions Mrs. Harper had described. They did not follow the shortest route between either gate. Instead, they curved gently toward an old oak before returning to the main path. Nothing suggested haste, nothing suggested concealment. The inspector remained still for several moments. A groundskeeper emerged from a nearby storage shed carrying a rake. "Morning. Good morning. You've come about the footprints." "I've come to look at them." The man rested both hands upon the rake handle. "They were there when I opened the gate." "Anyone else seen them?" "A few." "Did anyone recognize the boots?" The groundskeeper smiled. "Our village isn't quite that observant." Price smiled in return. "Sometimes it surprises me." The man glanced toward the oak. "I did notice one thing." "Go on." "Whoever walked there stood under the tree. For shelter? There wasn't enough rain then. What makes you think they stopped?" "The marks are deeper." Price stepped closer. The impressions beneath the oak indeed pressed more firmly into the softened earth than those leading toward it, as though someone had remained there for a minute or two before continuing. "What stands out from the tree?" the inspector asked. The groundskeeper considered the view, the church tower, and beyond that, the lane leading toward the bakery. Price thanked him before walking slowly toward the oak himself. From beneath its broad branches, the bakery roof appeared between two cottages, partly hidden, yet unmistakable. It was an ordinary view, yet it encouraged an ordinary question. Someone had paused there. Whether to rest, observe, or simply think remained impossible to determine. As he left the recreation ground, he encountered Clara Finch, approaching from the opposite direction with a basket covered by oilcloth. "You've chosen the wetter route," he observed. "I usually do. You don't mind the rain? It leaves fewer people outdoors." Price regarded her thoughtfully. A peaceful preference. "I've always found silence easier after rainfall." They continued together for several yards before she spoke again. "Mrs. Harper has probably mentioned footprints." "She has. She believes they belong to a stranger." "And you?" "I believe people notice unfamiliar footsteps more readily than familiar ones." The remark lingered after they parted. Back at the bakery, William had begun preparing the afternoon loaves when Peter Lang arrived carrying another bundle of post. "No more mysterious letters," the postman announced. "I wasn't expecting one." Peter looked toward the envelope beneath the till. "Funny thing. What is?" "I checked the delivery records. And? No letters have ever been addressed to Thomas Ashcombe here before." William waited. "But 3 different people asked me this morning whether I'd found him yet." "Interesting." They each spoke as though they already knew he existed. The bakery bell rang before either man could continue. The Reverend Ellison entered, brushing raindrops from his coat. "I've just crossed the recreation ground," he said. "Still muddy?" William asked. "Very." The vicar accepted a loaf before adding quietly, "It's remarkable how rain preserves some traces while washing others away." Inspector Price, arriving only moments later, heard the final sentence as he stepped inside. He offered the Reverend a courteous nod but said nothing. Instead, his eyes rested briefly upon the unopened envelope beneath the till. The rain had clarified the ground outside, yet the conversations surrounding the letter had become steadily less clear. Somewhere between fading memories, altered routines, and quiet observations, the village was beginning to reveal not what had happened, but how differently everyone had learned to remember it. The house stood at the far end of Elm Hollow, where the cottages thinned into scattered properties, separated by hedgerows and old orchards. Most residents passed it without giving it much thought. It possessed neither grandeur nor neglect, merely the settled appearance of a place that had long ago found its preferred shape. What distinguished it, according to village habit, was its gate. For years, the wooden gate had remained firmly closed, not locked, simply closed. Children cycling past noticed it. Dog walkers came to expect it. Even delivery drivers learned to pull the latch before entering. So when Mrs. Judith Larkin mentioned over tea that the gate had been standing open since early morning, several neighbors found themselves discussing the matter with greater seriousness than the occasion appeared to deserve. Inspector Price heard the remark while calling at the village shop. "The gate?" he asked. Mrs. Larkin nodded. "I've never seen it left open." Who lives there? Mr. Harold Fenwick. And is he in the habit of changing routines? Not that anyone has observed. The shopkeeper smiled politely, though I suspect we've all observed rather more than Mr. Fenwick intended. Price thanked them and continued towards Elm Hollow at his customary pace. The lane remained quiet. Recent rain had left the hedges bright with moisture, while sunlight filtering through the clouds lent every leaf an unusual freshness. Halfway along the road, he passed the village postman, Peter Lang, who balanced his satchel with the ease of long practice. "Morning, Inspector." "Good morning. Off to Mr. Fenwick's. It appears the news has travelled." Peter chuckled. "Open gates are surprisingly efficient messengers. Have you delivered there today?" "I have." "Anything unusual?" Peter considered the question. "Only that Mr. Fenwick seemed distracted." "In what way?" "He thanked me twice." "That doesn't sound alarming." "It isn't." Peter adjusted the strap across his shoulder. "He normally thanks me once." Price smiled faintly. "Then something has altered." The house came into view beyond a low hedge. The gate indeed stood wide open. It moved gently in the breeze, but showed no sign of damage. The garden beyond had been carefully maintained. Flower beds bordered the path with almost mathematical precision, while an apple tree leaned comfortably over the lawn. Mr. Harold Fenwick emerged before the inspector reached the door. A man in his late 60s, he possessed the neat appearance of someone who ironed handkerchiefs without considering the effort unusual. "Inspector, good morning. I suppose you're here about the gate." "I confess, it attracted my attention." Fenwick looked back towards it. "I left it open." "Deliberately?" "Entirely." Price waited. The older man gave a small, apologetic smile. "I was expecting a visitor." "Did the visitor arrive?" "No." "So the gate remained open." "I thought it courteous." The explanation sounded sincere. "And who were you expecting?" "A gentleman from the county archives." "What business had he here?" "He wrote asking whether I possessed documents relating to the previous owners." "Do you?" "I believe so." Fenwick led the inspector into a tidy sitting room where several old boxes rested upon a table. Bundles of letters, account books, and faded receipts lay arranged in careful order. "I've been sorting these all week." Price examined the nearest bundle without touching it. "You enjoy records." "I enjoy knowing where things belong." "And do they?" Fenwick smiled. "Usually." Tea arrived a few minutes later, carried by Mrs. Fenwick, whose quiet warmth balanced her husband's preference for precision. "My husband has spoken of little except those papers. They've occupied his attention. They've occupied the dining table." Fenwick accepted the observation with good humor. "I'm nearly finished." "So you said yesterday." Price listened without interruption. Married conversations often revealed character more clearly than formal interviews ever managed. While they drank their tea, the inspector's attention settled upon an old photograph resting beside the fireplace. It showed the house many decades earlier. The gate stood open. "You've changed it since then?" he asked. Fenwick followed his gaze. "No. It appears open in the picture." "It does. My grandfather preferred it that way. And you?" "I preferred certainty." There was no embarrassment in the reply, only quiet honesty. "What changed your mind?" Fenwick looked towards the window. "The letter from the archives." "The invitation?" "Yes. I realized I had been closing the gate out of habit rather than necessity." Mrs. Fenwick nodded. "He said much the same to me." Price rose and thanked them for their hospitality. Outside, he paused beside the gate before closing it gently. The latch settled into place with a soft click. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No hidden compartment had been discovered. No accusation had been made. Yet another ordinary habit had quietly altered, and with it came the reminder that people often remembered routines more faithfully than reasons. As he continued down the lane, the inspector reflected that villages rarely concealed their truths through elaborate deception. More often they buried them beneath customs repeated so faithfully that no one thought to ask why they had begun in the first place. Inspector Price spent the following morning calling upon several residents whose names had surfaced repeatedly during the week's conversations. He did not announce an investigation, for none had formally begun. Instead, he He accepted invitations for tea, admired carefully tended gardens, and allowed ordinary conversation to reveal what direct questioning seldom achieved. His first visit was to Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, whose drawing room overlooked the village green through tall sash windows. She welcomed him warmly, apologized for the untidy arrangement of correspondence upon a side table, and insisted that tea should precede every serious discussion. "I've always believed people speak more sensibly with a teacup in hand," she remarked. "And do they?" "Not always," Price smiled. "That is reassuring." Their conversation wandered through parish matters before settling, almost naturally, upon the mysterious letter that had occupied so many village minds. "I never met anyone called Thomas Ashcombe," Mrs. Whitcomb said thoughtfully. "At least, not that I remember." "You hesitate." "Only because memory has become rather unfashionable this week." "Why do you say that?" "Everyone appears equally certain and equally doubtful." Price nodded, but offered no opinion. When he left the house, he walked only a short distance before arriving at the cottage of Douglas Pierce. The retired solicitor received him in a study where shelves of well-used law books stood beside volumes of local history. "I wondered when you might appear. I hope I haven't become predictable." "Only pleasantly so." Pierce poured coffee instead of tea. "A dangerous innovation," the inspector observed. "My doctor insists." "And do you obey him?" "Occasionally." They discussed the growing uncertainty surrounding the letter. Pierce leaned back in his chair. "The village has become fascinated by names. Names matter." "They do." He paused. "But people often attach stories to them long after the facts have disappeared." Price regarded him with quiet interest. "You think that has happened here?" "I think it happens everywhere." Leaving the solicitor's house, the inspector crossed the green to call upon Clara Finch. She opened the door almost immediately, as though she had been expecting someone, though perhaps not him. "Good afternoon, Inspector. I hope I'm not interrupting. I was arranging flowers." She led him into a modest sitting room where freshly cut sweet peas filled the air with their delicate fragrance. Price noticed several framed photographs upon the mantelpiece. Most depicted village fetes, harvest suppers, and church gatherings from years gone by. "You've lived here a long time, long enough to mistake habit for history." The remark reminded him of something the Reverend Ellison had said only days before. "I've heard similar observations recently." Clara smiled faintly. Perhaps we all reach the same conclusions eventually. Their conversation remained courteous. Whenever the inspector mentioned old families or former residents, Clara answered honestly, but never at unnecessary length. She neither concealed information nor volunteered speculation. As he prepared to leave, his attention settled upon a small writing desk beneath the window. A fountain pen rested neatly beside a bottle of dark blue ink. "You still write letters?" "Whenever possible. A rare practice. I dislike saying important things in haste." The inspector inclined his head. "So do I." The afternoon carried him to the vicarage, where Reverend Ellison was trimming roses beside the front path. "You've chosen gardening over paperwork. The roses object less." They walked together through the churchyard while discussing village routines. Ellison eventually stopped beside an old stone bench. "I've noticed something curious." "What is that?" "People no longer ask who wrote the letter." Price looked towards the distant bakery. "They ask who should have received it." "Exactly. And you believe the distinction matters?" "I suspect it does." The inspector thanked him before continuing alone. By early evening, he returned to William Foster's bakery, where the day's trade had finally begun to slow. William was balancing the accounts. "The village has been unusually sociable, I've heard." Price rested one hand lightly upon the counter. "Has anyone asked to see the envelope today?" William considered. "Not directly, but several people looked at it." "Did they?" "Longer than before." Neither man spoke for a moment. Outside, neighbors exchanged cheerful greetings as they passed one another on the pavement. Inside, the bakery remained comfortably warm, carrying the familiar scent of fresh bread. The envelope still rested beneath the till. It had become part of the room without ever belonging there. Price watched it in thoughtful silence. Conversations behind respectable doors had produced courtesy, hospitality, and carefully measured recollections. Yet beneath every polite exchange lay the same quiet impression. The villagers were no longer simply trying to remember the past. They were beginning, almost without realizing it, to protect the version of it they preferred to believe. The parish hall had witnessed more disagreements than celebrations, though both were invariably followed by tea. Its walls carried framed photographs of fetes, harvest suppers, jubilee decorations, and committees whose members had once believed their minutes would preserve everything of importance. Inspector Price doubted the assumption. Official records tended to note decisions while quietly overlooking the conversations that had made them inevitable. Mrs. Agnes Bell unlocked the hall precisely at 10. "I hope you're not expecting excitement," she said as the inspector followed her inside. "I rarely expect it." "Then you'll seldom be disappointed." Dust drifted through the morning light as she opened a tall cupboard and withdrew several bound minute books tied with faded ribbon. "We've kept records for decades, so I've heard. They're painfully thorough. That is often useful." She placed the oldest volume upon a long oak table. Price turned the pages slowly. The handwriting changed over the years, reflecting different secretaries, different fashions, and different levels of patience. There were entries for flower shows, roof repairs, Christmas concerts, arguments about parking, and lengthy discussions concerning the purchase of new curtains. Everything appeared meticulously preserved. Everything, that is, except the reasons behind many decisions. Mrs. Bell watched him with polite curiosity. "You look disappointed." "Not disappointed." "What then?" "Interested." "In what?" "In what isn't here." She laughed softly. "You sound like a historian. I've met several. They always complain about missing information. They usually have cause." He paused at an entry dated nearly 20 years earlier. The committee had voted unanimously to relocate the annual summer fair from the recreation ground to the village green. No explanation followed. "Do you remember this change?" he asked. Mrs. Bell considered. "I remember that it happened." "Why?" She frowned. "I couldn't honestly tell you. There must have been discussion." "Oh, undoubtedly. But nothing written." She leaned over the book. "We tended to record outcomes, not conversations." Conversations wandered, sometimes in useful directions. Mrs. Bell smiled. They also wandered into gossip. Before she could say more, the hall door opened. Douglas Pierce entered carrying a folder beneath one arm. "I thought I might find you here, Inspector. You know the building well?" "I spent 12 years on the committee." Mrs. Bell handed him a cup of tea. "Perhaps you can remember what I cannot." Pierce examined the old minute book. "The summer fair?" "Yes." He remained silent for several moments. "I believe there was concern about the ground becoming waterlogged." Mrs. Bell looked uncertain. "I thought it had something to do with parking." "Perhaps both." Inspector Price closed the volume gently. "Interesting." Neither witness sounded convinced by the explanation offered. As the morning continued, more committee books appeared. They documented purchases, resignations, elections, donations, repairs, and votes carried by narrow margins. Yet every important disagreement seemed to have been compressed into a single courteous sentence. After luncheon, the current committee secretary, Miss Ruth Harding, arrived with additional files. "I found these in the storage cupboard." She placed several envelopes upon the table. Old correspondence. Price examined them carefully. Most concerned suppliers and insurance matters. One bundle contained letters discussing preparations for a village anniversary celebration many years before. Several names recurred throughout the exchange. One did not. "Who was Eleanor Ashcombe?" he asked. Miss Harding searched her memory. "I've heard the name." Mrs. Bell looked up sharply. "So have I." Douglas Pierce adjusted his spectacles. "She attended meetings occasionally." "What became of her?" asked the inspector. The three looked at one another. No one answered immediately. Finally, Pierce spoke. "I don't know." Mrs. Bell nodded slowly. "I can't remember when she stopped coming." Miss Harding looked through another folder. "Her name doesn't appear in the minutes." Price looked again at the correspondence. It appeared only in the letters, never in the official record. "Curious," he murmured. Mrs. Bell folded her hands. "Do you think it's important? I think omissions sometimes deserve as much attention as entries." By late afternoon, the search had produced no dramatic discovery. There was no hidden confession, no missing document explaining every uncertainty. Instead, a quieter pattern emerged. The committee had faithfully recorded resolutions while allowing personalities to fade. People who contributed without holding office appeared briefly in private correspondence before disappearing altogether from the formal history of the village. As the inspector prepared to leave, Douglas Pierce walked with him to the door. "I've been thinking about your question. Which one? Why certain names vanish?" And Pierce glanced back towards the shelves of minute books. "Institutions remember differently from people." Price considered the remark. People forget accidentally, and committees, they forget politely. Outside, the afternoon sun had returned after a morning of drifting cloud. Children crossed the green on their way home from school, while neighbors exchanged greetings outside the bakery. The village appeared as settled and orderly as ever, yet somewhere between official records and private recollections, Inspector Price sensed that an important piece of the story had slipped quietly from memory, not because anyone intended to conceal it, but because everyone had assumed someone else would remember. Courtesy, Inspector Price often reflected, possessed an unusual talent for concealing discomfort. A carefully chosen phrase could postpone an argument for years, while a polite silence might preserve a friendship long after trust had quietly departed. Villages, more than most places, depended upon such understandings. People met too frequently to afford unnecessary honesty. The thought accompanied him as he returned to William Foster's bakery the following morning. Business had settled into its familiar rhythm. Warm loaves lined the shelves. The bell above the door announced each customer with dependable cheerfulness, and the mysterious envelope remained beneath the till, untouched yet no longer ignored. William greeted the inspector with a nod. "I've had another visitor, asking about the letter." "No," Price waited, asking whether anyone had claimed it. "A distinction? I thought so. Who was it?" William frowned thoughtfully. "A gentleman I recognized but couldn't immediately place. He apologized twice for troubling me." "Did he give his name?" "No. Did you ask? It seemed discourteous." Price smiled faintly. "So, courtesy prevented curiosity." "I suppose it did." Before either man could continue, the bell sounded again. Mrs. Agnes Bell entered carrying a neatly folded list. "I've come for the committee refreshments." William collected the order while the inspector greeted her. "You've been busy. The committee insists on discussing the harvest supper. They've discussed it before. They intend to discuss it again." She accepted the parcels before lowering her voice. "I remembered something after yesterday." "The correspondence?" "No." She hesitated. "The name Ashcombe," Price regarded her attentively. "I still cannot place it. But I realized why it troubled me." "Go on." "It wasn't because I knew the family." She paused. "It was because everyone else behaved as though I should." The remark remained with the inspector after she departed. Later that afternoon, he attended the committee meeting as an observer rather than a participant. No one objected. Villagers had become accustomed to his quiet presence, and meetings generally continued much as they always had. The chairman opened with routine business, repairs to the hall roof, preparations for the harvest supper, a proposal to repaint the notice board. Everything proceeded with remarkable efficiency until discussion turned to historical displays for the forthcoming village anniversary. "We should include photographs," suggested Mrs. Bell, "and the old committee records," added Douglas Pierce. Someone proposed inviting residents to lend family documents for exhibition. Several members nodded in agreement. Then Clara Finch spoke for the first time. "If people lend private letters, they should receive them back unopened." The room became unexpectedly quiet. The chairman looked mildly surprised. "I believe that would be understood. It should also be stated." "Why?" "Because courtesy deserves clarity." No one challenged the suggestion. Instead, it was entered into the minutes without debate. Inspector Price watched the exchange with quiet interest. It was a small amendment, yet Clara had spoken with unusual firmness. When the meeting concluded, villagers lingered outside beneath the evening sky, discussing flowers, weather, and seating arrangements rather than committee decisions. Price walked beside the Reverend Ellison toward the church gate. A peaceful meeting. On the surface, the Reverend smiled. Most committee meetings aspire to that. Did you notice Miss Finch? I did. What did you make of her remark? Ellison considered before answering. She wasn't talking about exhibitions. I reached the same conclusion. The Reverend glanced towards the village green. There are occasions when people defend principles because they cannot comfortably discuss particular events. Price nodded. A general statement protects a private memory. Precisely. The inspector continued alone until he reached the bakery once more. William was preparing to close. No developments? He asked. Several. None visible, I imagine. Very few. William looked towards the envelope. I've almost grown accustomed to seeing it there. So has everyone else. And that's important? I think so. The baker turned the key in the front door after the final customer departed. Outside, the green lay quiet beneath the lengthening shadows of evening. It strikes me, William said, that no one has ever suggested opening the letter simply to settle the matter. Price looked back through the shop window. They've suggested many things. But not that. No. Why? The inspector answered without hesitation. Because every person in the village believes the letter belongs to someone else. William reflected upon the reply. That's rather considerate. It is. Price allowed the silence to settle before adding, sometimes consideration preserves more than good manners. The bakery lights dimmed as William completed his closing routine. Across the green, neighbors exchanged courteous farewells before disappearing behind familiar doors, each carrying private recollections shaped as much by restraint as by certainty. The inspector remained for a moment beside the empty pavement. During the past days, he had heard countless opinions, careful corrections, forgotten names, and hesitant memories. Individually, they explained very little. Together, they revealed something far more significant. The village had not been united by what it remembered. It had been united by what, out of courtesy, everyone had quietly agreed never to ask. The following morning dawned with a calm that seemed almost deliberate. Overnight rain had washed the village roofs clean, and sunlight rested gently upon the stone cottages surrounding the green. William Foster unlocked the bakery, as he always did, swept the threshold, arranged the fresh loaves, and finally looked toward the cream envelope that had occupied the same place for more than a week. It appeared no different from the day it had arrived, yet the village surrounding it had changed. Customers no longer speculated quite so eagerly. Conversations had become quieter, less concerned with discovering an explanation than with deciding whether one was necessary. The mystery had ceased to belong to the letter alone. It had become part of the village's understanding of itself. Inspector Price arrived shortly after opening. Good morning, William smiled. I had a feeling you'd come. I believe the time has arrived. For what? To stop asking the wrong question. William looked towards the envelope. You know who wrote it. I believe I know something rather more useful. The bakery gradually filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Harper appeared first, followed by Douglas Pierce, Reverend Ellison, Mrs. Bell, Peter Lang, Clara Finch, and several others whose curiosity overcame any pretense of ordinary shopping. No invitations had been issued, yet villagers possessed a remarkable instinct for assembling when quiet matters approached their conclusion. Price waited until everyone had settled. Then he spoke in his usual measured voice. We have all spent several days asking who Thomas Ashcombe might be. Mrs. Harper nodded. Naturally. It seemed the obvious question. It was. He paused. And because it appeared obvious, we overlooked another. Douglas Pierce folded his hands. Which was? Why was the bakery chosen at all? Silence followed. The inspector continued. The address was incomplete, yet it reached precisely the place where almost everyone in the village eventually passes. Peter Lang gave a thoughtful nod. The bakery sees everyone. Exactly. Price looked around the room. The writer expected the intended reader to hear about the letter. Mrs. Bell frowned. Not necessarily to collect it. Precisely. William glanced at the unopened envelope. Then Thomas Ashcombe may never have lived here. I believe that is correct. Several people exchanged uncertain looks. Price continued calmly. During the past week, I have heard many memories. They disagreed about strangers, dates, appearances, and conversations. Yet they agreed in one respect. What was that? Asked the Reverend. Every time the name Ashcombe appeared, someone felt it sounded familiar. Clara Finch lowered her eyes, but no one knew why. No one wished to ask why. The room remained perfectly still. The committee remembered correspondence but not contributors. Old photographs survived after names faded. Families recalled routines while forgetting their beginnings. Courtesy replaced curiosity. Douglas Pierce looked towards the window, and we convinced ourselves that forgetting was natural. Sometimes it is. The inspector gently lifted the envelope from beneath the till. I do not believe this letter was intended to reveal a secret. Mrs. Harper looked puzzled. Then why send it? To remind someone of what? That memory fades more quickly when people rely upon others to preserve it. No one interrupted. Price carefully turned the envelope over in his hands. There has been much discussion about whether it should be opened. William nodded. No one ever suggested doing so, because every person believed it belonged to someone else. The inspector smiled faintly. That was the village's finest quality. He placed the envelope back upon the counter. It remained unopened because everyone respected an absent stranger. Peter Lang exhaled quietly. So what happens now? The same thing that should have happened on the first morning. William understood before anyone else. We return it. Price inclined his head. Marked addressee unknown. Mrs. Bell looked almost disappointed. That's all? I believe so. Mrs. Harper hesitated. But we'll never know what it contained. No. And that doesn't trouble you? The inspector considered the question. It interests me. There's a difference? A considerable one. The Reverend Ellison smiled. I rather think that's the answer to many mysteries. The gathering gradually dissolved into smaller conversations. The tension that had quietly accompanied the letter throughout the week seemed to lift without anyone noticing precisely when it happened. Peter accepted the envelope from William. I'll send it back this afternoon. Thank you, said the baker. When the postman left, the space beneath the till looked unexpectedly empty. William laughed softly. I've grown accustomed to seeing it there. So had the rest of us, Price replied. Outside, the village continued with its ordinary morning. Children crossed the green on their way to school. Mrs. Bell discussed flower arrangements with a neighbor. Douglas Pierce paused to admire a newly repaired garden wall. Clara Finch walked slowly towards the church, carrying fresh blossoms for the porch. Nothing outwardly had changed, yet something quieter had settled into place. The mystery had never depended upon discovering a hidden villain, exposing deception, or forcing a confession. It had rested upon recognizing how communities preserve themselves, not only through memory, but through restraint, courtesy, and an instinctive respect for lives that may never be fully understood. Inspector Price stood for a final moment outside the bakery before beginning the walk towards the station. William watched him disappear beyond the green. The baker returned inside, arranged a fresh basket of warm loaves upon the counter, and welcomed his next customer with the same easy greeting he had offered every morning for years. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. The unanswered letter had departed. The village remained. And in that quiet continuation, Inspector Price suspected everyone had learned something more valuable than the contents of any forgotten envelope could ever have revealed.